You know what I love? Classic Spyro. And making stuff in 3D. So, I'm gonna make a Vaporwave dragon in a classic Spyro inspired style. Why? Because you cannot stop me. That's why. Okay, but in all seriousness, I had actually have been thinking about doing some videos where I record myself and give commentary about my process and thoughts. I also was talking to a friend on DeviantArt recently, and she seemed pretty interested in the idea too. For this video, I'm going to go over my entire process, from designing the character to the final rig and animation. I hope to maybe make this into a little series where I can make a character model and go over my process and thoughts. Not exactly a tutorial, but more just me going over what I'm doing and explaining some of my thoughts slash reasoning. And I'll put up the resulting model for free download. But if you are interested in seeing a proper dedicated tutorial series from me, I was planning on starting one once I can get some supporters on my Patreon. I just want to get to $5 a month before I start on that. But anyway, let's get started. I start out with a fairly simple, rough sketch on some paper. I just find that paper is the most simple and easy to use medium for sketching out my rough ideas. Unfortunately, I don't really have an easy way to cleanly record myself sketching, so I can't really show that part of the process. But I can sort of go over the design aspects in my sketch. For the sketching phase, I kind of avoid going into markings and smaller details like prints or patterns. Not only do I prefer adding those in the coloring stage, but I also feel it helps to keep the sketch more readable. Though, if I have a very specific idea for a symbol or marking or something, I will add it in just so I can remember when I color it. For the physical design of the dragon, I decided to go with a Western looking design, quadrupedal with two wings and a pair of horns. I also gave my dragon a pair of cow-like ears with some earrings. I thought that they kinda added to the punkish vaporwave look I was going for. I also gave the dragon some sickle-styled horns and a broken CD halo. I felt like it kinda added to the digital surreal aesthetic of vaporwave, especially with how the sickle horns kinda carry the CD motif. I also gave my dragon a pair of simple shades slash glasses. Once again, I thought that a pair of simple but colorful shades would add to the look I was trying to achieve. Plus, I like them and I think they look cool. I ended up giving the dragon a mohawk. I wasn't sure what kind of crest to give my dragon, and considered the idea of maybe a stream of like some kind of digital fire or something. The dragon's head just looked really naked without any crest. I decided on a mohawk for a bit of a punkish look. I also feel like it fits with the earrings and glasses. I gave the dragon a pair of simple blobby eyebrows because I like simple blobby eyebrows. They're cute. I gave the dragon some glitchy looking eyes because vaporwave and cool. For the rest of the dragon's body, it's mostly pretty standard Spyro inspired OC stuff. Quadrupedal, mammalian style feet, a tucked in waist, and, well, dragon claws. I recognize that no real animal has anatomy like this, but dragons aren't real and I don't really care. Like, look, I recognize that I'm no Da Vinci and my anatomy and proportions definitely need work, but I don't care that much, to be honest. I'm more interested in making art that I like than making stuff that looks like it's actually real. Like, I am working on my art, but it's not my top priority. Anyway, I gave the dragon an attached wing membrane. Not because it's more realistic or anatomically correct, even though it is, but rather because I like the look over the alternative. I also made the lower forelegs of the dragon's stone pillars. I found that Greco-Roman architecture was a common motif in vaporwave art, and I thought it would be a cool way of linking into that idea. I also put some glowing rings around the back, legs, and base of the tail to help round out the design and keep the back section from looking too plain. Finally, I gave the dragon a dolphin fin for the end of its tail. Dolphins are also a common theme in vaporwave art, so I thought it would be fitting. Also, my dragon breeds magic CD shards. On to the coloring process. I start out by loading the concept sketch into Fire Alpaca, my art program of choice. It's really good and free. I do recommend it. Anyway, I make a new layer on top of the sketch and call it line art. I prefer to keep my line art sketch and color layers separate as it makes it easier to edit the image and undo mistakes. I use the default pen size with the color black and trace over my sketch. It's not super important to get the lines exactly right, as this is only meant to be a concept sketch. The most important thing is readability, being able to tell what is being depicted. I usually trace over the image one bit at a time. It helps keep the line art cleaner and more accurate. Also, it means less work undone if I make a mistake and have to undo. After I'm done with the line art, I make another layer in between the sketch and line art layers. I call it base. It's the base color layer. But first, I finish some lines I missed. Whoops. I also make the color layer just for the eyes. I like to do a lot of shading and coloring effects on them, so it's just easier to make them their own layer. For laying the base color, I start by filling in the line work with a color that can contrast both the background sketch and the line art. In this case, it's a lovely violet color. And with that, I carefully fill in all the colored space in the image. I do this instead of coloring the design all at once because for me, it makes it easier to color when I already have a base to color for. I also make a separate color layer for the portrait. Again, it's simply because it makes the coloring process easier for me. Next, I decide a palette and fill in the proper colors. So, I make a new layer, this time called palette, and I only use this layer purely for holding the color palette of the design. It's so much more simple to color something when you have clean, easily eye-dropped colors in the topmost layer. I also make sure to save my progress. Saving is important. Trust me, technology is not your friend. For the palette, I decided the base color would be a nice, deep, dark purple, with neon pink, gold, and cyan. Since the design features some hollow elements, I put some light pastel pink, blue, and purple to represent it. I also ended up adding a neon purple color. Vaporwave is heavy on the 80s/90s aesthetic, which uses a lot of neon, so I decided the base color of the dragon should be a dark color to add a nice contrast. Also, the color reminds me of the night sky, and neon lights show best during the night. I start by marking out the colors for the underbelly and wings, since those have a gradient/multicolor effect. Making gradients and color effects always gets a bit messy, so I do those first. That way I can just color over with the flat colors. Speaking of gradients, I start marking out the hollow areas next, since that's also a multicolor effect. I also marked out the glasses, since I plan on doing multicolor for those too. Then I grab my gold color and use the watercolor brush to make a vaporwavy sunset effect on the wings, by sweeping the brush around to make the effect of waves or rays of light. Next, I grab my blue and start laying that onto the pink to make a gradiented effect. I do a similar effect for the wings and on the glasses for a cool look. Next, I go back to the hollow coloring, back over with the gold layered on it, and start layering on pinks and blues over the purple to make a kind of iridescent slash hollow effect. It's not perfect, but I like how it looks. With most of the gradient effects done, I get started on the flat colors. I make the mohawk blue and started the eyebrows as blue. Next, I take a pastel blue for the leg pillars, as it's the closest to a marble color in the palette. Then, I make the claws a neon blue and start coloring the glowing rings on the character, making the first blue, the second purple, and the last pink. Next, I do the earring. I would have marked this out as the beginning with the rest of the hollow parts, but I colored my designs more or less on the fly. I mean, I usually already have at least some idea of how I want to do the colors to look, but when I'm making it, I'm usually still deciding exactly how I want the character to look. Part of the reason why I keep the color its own layer is it makes redoing color choices easier. Speaking of which, I colored the eyes next, and well, I didn't have an exact idea in mind of how I wanted the eyes to look color-wise, so I kind of experimented a bit to see what I liked. I ultimately decided on pink eyes with a minor gradient and blue pupils with little blue glitch bars. I also use the pastel blue for the sclera, which, fun fact, I use very light blue in lieu of actual white often in my art and designs. It still reads as white while still being able to receive minor highlights and looks a bit better in my opinion. With the eyes colored, I start adding the base color. As you can see, it's a lot less worrisome to add that color last when there's no worry of accidentally mixing it. Then I added some pink bags under the eyes and made a cool heart and line tattoo. I drew the tattoo on a different layer to make it simpler to edit. Finally, I colored the portrait, starting with the hollow effects. Then I did the glasses and recolored the eyebrows pink, colored the mohawk, the underbelly, and finished the glasses and colored the main body. Modeling time. I start with a simple cube and stretch it lengthwise. I add 2 loop cuts in the cube and split it down the middle while adding another cut on one side. I extrude 2 faces to form the basis for legs and start forming the waist. I add more loop cuts on the legs, shaping out a hind leg and then a foreleg. Next, I round out the body a little to make it less boxy. Then I add a cylinder and form the tail, extruding one side to make a dolphin-type shape and mirroring the tail. Then I add another cube, smoothing it to make a more sphere-like shape. I place it right around where I think the head should go and extrude a neck that I connect to the body, rounding it out. I also make sure to edit all over a shape a little so the head doesn't look too awkward. Then I add toruses to make the rings on the hind legs and tail. I extrude and shape the snout before shaping discs onto the eyes, into the eyes, eyebrows, and glasses. I merge everything together, delete half, then mirror. I cut the edges into the snout and make a mouth, and I make another disc into the broken CD halo. Then I take a plane and form it into a wing shape, cutting it and pulling the edges as needed. I extrude the shape to give it thickness and merge one side together to create a tapered effect. I get another torus and make the sickle horns. I take another cylinder and make it into the ears, make the hair, and then I make the a hoagie, or however it's pronounced. I'm not sure. I merge everything together again and cut the model in half for doing the UVs. I find that this saves UV space and time for symmetrical designs. I cut up each piece, fitting them all together on the UV plane. When I'm done, I export it as a PNG image and import that into Fire Alpaca. When making the texture, the first thing I do is make a layer under the UVs and have this as my bottom/base color. For this, it's the dragon scales. Then I go into making another layer for each part of the design and adding the base colors. Once I have all the base colors on, I save the texture and load it onto the model to check that each part of the texture is placed correctly. Once that's done, I do the details of each part of the texture. I use multiply layers for shadows and add layers for the highlights. I tend to go a bit ham on this part as I love making my textures nice and juicy. Also, I find that using the same color with different layer effects for highlighting and shading adds a neat effect and makes the result much more vibrant. For the tattoo, I just copy it from the concept art and trace it for the texture. I can't be bothered to try to redraw it from scratch. Sorry. While I'm texturing, I'll also save out and check in Maya to see how it looks on the model and adjust it as needed. With the textures done, I export the model and import it into Blender. I make sure to name the material to Vapor Dragon Mat, as keeping things named when you work in 3D is just good practice. Material 1, 2, 3 can get confusing when you have multiple objects in the file. Anyway, because Blender has some super awesome material effects, I divide the material up into three things: the main material, an emissive material that are referred to as Vapor Dragon Glow, and a glossy material for the hollow parts to add the hollow effect. With the materials laid out, I add bones. I start with a master bone for moving/containing the whole armature. Then I make a root bone in the pelvis and make bones for the spine, tail, head, jaw, neck, and legs, as well as for the wings, and even for the ahogi, or however it's pronounced, I'm sorry. Unlike real animals, 3D models only need bones for the part of the model for the parts of the model that are meant to move. After I form the skeleton, I name each bone because without names, trying to figure out which is which is a nightmare. Trust me. Then I add IKs to the legs so the model can plant its feet and walk without its feet slipping everywhere. Also, IKs are a perfect example of why it's good to name your bones. It's so much easier to tell that the correct parts are being used for constraints. Once that's done, I parent the model to the armature using automatic weighting. Blender's automatic weighting system isn't perfect, but any parts that are wrong are easily corrected and it saves a lot of time. So I move around each bone, making sure that each part is weighted correctly. Anything that doesn't look right, I just edit the weighting until it does look right. Remember how I said my dragon has magic CD shard breath? Well, that's relevant now. Back in Maya, I make a primitive cone and lower the subdivisions to 4. I'm going for a low poly look, so the extra 16 are really unnecessary. I bring the cone in front of the dragon's face and rotate it by 90 degrees. Next, I make a primitive plane. I lower the subdivisions to 1, as I only need 1 and more just waste polygons. I bring it up to the dragon's face and once again rotate it. Next, I merge one end of the plane together for a tapered effect and connect it to the cone. Then, I merge the primitives and duplicate the object, rotating and moving it to create a cone-type effect. In the classic Spyro games, they made Spyro's flame breath with a similar effect. With the breath modeled, I combine the parts, save the file, and export it as an OBJ file. In Blender again, I import the object. Because I modeled it in front of the dragon's face, it imports in the same exact spot. Saves time, because I don't have to manually place it. While it looks cool already, I modify the material file, changing it from transparent to opaque, naming the material CD Breath Matte, making it a light purple color, and creating an effect with metallic and emissive effects. With the material completed, I make some shape keys. The first one I add is Basis, which is created by default. Then I make my shape key, which I name Breath. The effect shrinks the breath object and hides it in the head. So switching it on and off makes it look like it's flying out of my dragon's mouth. With the breath done, I start animating the dragon. I start by making a base pose. I make the tail look more relaxed for a regular idle pose. Next, I make a lowered pose for the breath animation. I copy the idle pose to the end to make the animation loop. Between the breath and idle pose, I make another copy of the breath pose and edit it into a more aggressive stance with the mouth open for the breath attack. Next, I add in some frames for the head to swing back and forth. I add a frame for the front left and back right paws to lift up when they change positions, making a step. Then I add some overshot to the tail, and then I make an anticipation frame with the dragon stretching back before unleashing the breath attack. With all the frames done, I move around to make the animation less floaty. When I am satisfied with the timing, I add the breath effect using the shape keys. With everything looking good, I render the final product. So, that's how I made this lovely Vaporwave dragon. All in all, it took about 5 hours to make, maybe a little more as there were some minor corrections I did off screen. If you're interested in the model, it's available for free download in the description. Anyway, funnily enough, I got my first patron while working on this video, so I plan on doing some proper low poly tutorials soon. And if you happen to be interested in getting more tutorials or just want to support me as an artist, my Patreon is linked below. And even if you can't do Patreon, or even if you don't want to, a like, share, subscribe to my YouTube channel, or even just a kind comment will suffice. Like, honestly, I appreciate any and all support I can get. I'm not picky at all. And thanks for watching my video, and have a lovely day.